It struck me like a cold slap, watching Frederick Hendricks stand at the podium, his words smooth as silk, praising my unwavering dedication and exceptional results during the annual company meeting. Yet beneath that public compliment lay an invisible chasm, one I had come to sense but couldn't fully name until that moment. I am Joseph King, Senior Account Manager at Hendricks & Co., a boutique financial consulting firm with $15 million in annual revenue. For 9 years, I've been the backbone of this operation, managing 53 active clients responsible for over $8.5 million in billings, more than half the company's income. My proprietary pricing algorithm and custom service delivery framework, though undocumented, are deeply embedded in every negotiation and operational workflow I handle. Without me, the firm's client retention would falter, margins would shrink, and confidence with key accounts would erode. Yet Frederick's veiled wariness grows, evidenced by his increasing exclusion of me from strategic discussions, subtle but unmistakable. I remember the first time I met Frederick after college, freshly graduated and eager. He was a towering figure, a co-founder with the charisma and ruthless drive to match. For 8 years, our relationship was symbiotic. He mentored me, helping me ascend quickly while I delivered steady revenue growth. But in the last 12 months, the dynamic shifted. Frederick began bypassing me on critical client contract renewals, signing amendments without my input. I recalled a client renewal last fall, quietly altered without my knowledge. My commission slashed by $118,000 annually. I rationalized it as Q4 stress, reorganization pains. After all, the firm's hierarchy tilted toward Frederick's dominance. He owns 60% equity, while I hold 25%. When Frederick's daughter Emily, fresh out of college, landed a junior management role despite no relevant experience, I noted the growing imbalance. The company culture rewards loyalty to Frederick's vision, often sidelining formal procedures and meritocracy. Still, I clung to professionalism, archiving every email and contract meticulously, anticipating that this erosion might only be the beginning. The real weight of my contribution often goes unseen beyond the numbers. Over years, I developed our proprietary client pricing algorithm from scratch, a complex formula integrating client risk profiles, service tiers, and market fluctuations. This tool increases profitability by an average of 12%, a technical edge that no one else at Hendricks & Co. fully understands or controls. It lives in my mind and on my personal encrypted drive as company IT policy delegates sensitive data storage to trusted senior managers. Alongside that, I cultivated direct relationships with 3 of our 5 largest clients, bringing them from my prior position, earning their loyalty personally, not to the firm's brand. I maintain control over contracts containing a rarely discussed kill switch, enabling temporary suspension of services under breach scenarios. This leverage is my contingency, a silent safeguard. Outside the office, my wife Sarah supports me, understanding the tension beneath my composure. Mark Dawson, our legal counsel, and HR Director Linda Barrett are aware of the firm's internal dynamics, but tread carefully. Even Eric Porter, a trusted ex-colleague, recognizes my integrity, but warns me against overt confrontation. Then came the annual bonus distribution, the first unmistakable act of disregard. Despite my portfolio generating $5 million, Frederick awarded the $45,000 bonus not to me, but to Emily, who had been with the company a mere 6 months and managed a trivial client list. The announcement landed as a terse company-wide email, Frederick framing the decision as a nod to fresh perspective and family legacy. The message was clear: loyalty to the family outweighs decades of proven performance. I archived the email immediately, cross-referencing it with my 9-year string of flawless reviews and revenue contributions. My response was measured. I emailed HR and Frederick directly, requesting clarification on the bonus criteria and attaching the performance records that justified my claim. Frederick's reply was defensive, cloaked in the language of strategic investment in future leadership. It was plausible, yet transparent nepotism. Disappointed but undeterred, I recorded the incident in my personal compliance log. I chose to refrain from confrontation, knowing that patience and observation now serve me better than impulsive challenge. The $45,000 bonus was more than money. It was a signal, a small but significant erosion of authority and respect, and I was already calculating my next move. The subtle resistance I displayed didn't go unnoticed. Within weeks, the atmosphere shifted palpably. Frederick's tactics escalated with surgical precision. I was systematically excluded from pivotal meetings, those that shaped client acquisition strategies and dictated budget allocations. Despite managing clients responsible for more than half the firm's revenue, my input was increasingly dismissed. My presence reduced to that of an observer. The most glaring move was Emily's rapid promotion. She was suddenly overseeing the very clients I had cultivated for years. I watched her take the reins of my largest accounts, her inexperience masked by Frederick's aggressive endorsement. It was clear. Frederick was recalibrating the power structure, replacing merit with allegiance. Rumors began to circulate, not openly, but through whispered corridors and pointed glances. Colleagues I once trusted started to distance themselves, influenced by Frederick's subtle manipulations. Phrases like, "Joseph's leadership style isn't adapting well," or "his approach feels outdated," floated just beneath the surface. The implication was clear. I was becoming a liability. Meanwhile, the marketing budget under my projects was slashed by $350,000 and rerouted to Emily's initiatives without explanation. This diverted funding caused inevitable delays and strained client deliverables. I meticulously logged every memo, every budget report, every meeting minute, documenting the pattern of deliberate marginalization. Despite the mounting pressures, I maintained professionalism, ensuring every communication was formal and recorded. I was playing by the rules, quietly amassing evidence for a confrontation yet to come. Each day, the tension thickened. Walking through the office, the shifting alliances weighed heavily. Former allies now offered polite nods rather than collaboration. The hum of fluorescent lights overhead seemed louder in meetings where my voice was ignored, yet I noted every detail, every slight, every maneuver. Frederick's overreach was methodical, but his arrogance underestimated my resolve. I was not simply enduring these changes, I was adapting, planning. The firm still depended on my expertise, my proprietary pricing models and client relationships, even as Frederick tried to erode my authority. I knew this was the opening salvo in a broader campaign to displace me, and I prepared accordingly. This wasn't about ego. It was about protecting the integrity of my work and the company's future. The cold calculus was clear. Frederick's aggression was designed to provoke a reaction, to isolate me until I either capitulated or was forced out. But I refused to play that game blindly. Instead, I consolidated my evidence, creating a detailed chronology of Frederick's moves. This record was my shield and my sword. With each budget cut and sidelined meeting, my patience grew thinner, but my strategy sharpened. I understood the importance of restraint. A misstep could hand Frederick the narrative advantage. So I kept my head down, delivered results where possible, and prepared for the moment when I would confront the rot at the firm's core. Frederick was escalating, but so was my readiness. The situation reached a point where passive documentation was no longer sufficient. I decided to initiate a formal dialogue, an attempt to resolve the escalating conflict through established channels. I scheduled a meeting with Linda Barrett, the HR director, presenting a comprehensive dossier, internal memos highlighting my exclusion from key meetings, detailed financial records showing unauthorized budget reallocations, and correspondence evidencing discrepancies in bonus allocations. I requested mediation and demanded a review of firm governance practices, citing clear violations of our partnership agreement, particularly clauses mandating equitable treatment and financial transparency. Linda's initial response was cautious, her tone measured as she acknowledged my concerns. She assured me that a preliminary inquiry would be conducted, but underneath that veneer of protocol, it became evident that Frederick's influence ran deep. Through private conversations, Linda confided that the board held unwavering loyalty to Frederick. The informal, opaque power structure favored the majority partner's autonomy to an extent that rendered minority objections largely symbolic. This revelation was frustrating but not unexpected. I pressed further, escalating the matter to Mark Dawson, our legal counsel, for a rigorous interpretation of the partnership agreement. Mark's analysis confirmed my suspicions. Frederick's unilateral budget decisions blatantly violated the clause requiring unanimous consent for expenditures exceeding $100,000. The partnership agreement was explicit, yet enforcement was lacking. When I brought these findings back to the board, the response was dismissive. They justified Frederick's actions under the guise of business autonomy and family leadership succession, effectively sidelining governance safeguards. The system was failing me. Minority protections were paper-thin against the board's loyalty to Frederick. Despite this, I stayed professional, understanding that any reaction needed to be measured and strategic. Legal recourse was a distant but increasingly necessary consideration. In the meantime, I redoubled my documentation efforts, knowing that external intervention might soon become inevitable. The retaliation intensified with a precision that left little room for doubt about Frederick's intent. The promotion I had been approved for, Director of Client Relations, was frozen indefinitely. This was no bureaucratic oversight. No formal explanation was provided. The projected financial impact was significant. A $30,000 annual salary increase withheld, amounting to $180,000 lost over 3 years, alongside the opportunity cost of expanded team leadership. More damaging, however, was Frederick's covert campaign to undermine my client base. He personally contacted several of my top clients, pitching alternative service packages through Emily. These offers were packaged attractively, with incentives clearly designed to entice my accounts away. Within weeks, 6 of my largest clients defected, slashing my portfolio's revenue by approximately $950,000 annually. The professional blow was staggering, searing through the foundation of my career at Hendricks & Co. The strain wasn't confined to the office. At home, Sarah's concern grew palpable. Our plans to start a family, long deferred, now seemed further out of reach. The stagnant income and professional uncertainty etched lines of worry into her face. I heard her in quiet moments, questioning if I should consider other opportunities, but I remained steadfast. Several colleagues, previously silent, observed Frederick's maneuvers with unease, yet fear and loyalty constrained their actions. I was increasingly isolated, yet the clarity of Frederick's bad faith only strengthened my resolve. The war was no longer covert. It was an open campaign to dismantle my position and leverage. I began seriously contemplating external legal and regulatory strategies, recognizing that internal mediation had failed. The gravity of the situation compelled me to take decisive action. I drafted a comprehensive letter to the firm's board of directors, assembling 9 years of performance data, detailed contract analyses, and meticulously documented breaches by Frederick, including unauthorized budget reallocations, suspicious embezzlement activities, and clear governance violations. The letter was not merely accusatory, it offered a path toward remediation. I requested a formal board meeting to address these critical concerns and proposed corrective measures to restore integrity and trust. Importantly, I explicitly extended Frederick an opportunity to rectify the issues internally, aiming to avoid regulatory escalation and preserve the company's reputation. The letter was sent via tracked courier and encrypted email, ensuring delivery and receipt acknowledgement by every board member. The anticipation was acute. I awaited their response with a mixture of calculated calm and underlying urgency. When the board convened, their verdict was devastatingly clear. They summarily rejected my requests, reaffirming board confidence in Frederick's leadership, without addressing the substance of my claims. Almost immediately, Frederick retaliated by denying me access to the firm's internal client management system, crippling my ability to service the few clients I still retained. This calculated move was a clear message. My role was being neutered. Faced with this unambiguous rejection and overt retaliation, I concluded that all legitimate internal avenues had been exhausted. The system was complicit in protecting Frederick's unchecked power at my expense. My decision crystallized. I would escalate beyond the firm's opaque governance. Regulatory authorities and legal frameworks outside Hendricks & Co. would be the instruments to restore justice. The meticulous records I had amassed would serve as the foundation for this battle. Frederick believed he had silenced me, but I had only begun to mobilize. The demotion came without ceremony, a silent coup executed with meticulous coldness. Overnight, my title vanished from internal directories, replaced by the bland client advisor, a euphemism for irrelevance. My office was reassigned, relocated to a cramped, poorly lit corner with a single outdated desktop that froze during even the simplest tasks. The hum of the ancient air conditioning mixed with the dull clatter of keyboards around me, emphasizing my isolation. The new seating arrangement put me physically distant from any meaningful interaction. This wasn't just a demotion, it was a signal to the entire firm that I was expendable. The internal communications that followed were a masterclass in veiled insinuation. Frederick's weekly newsletters began to carry subtle jabs, phrases like, "Embracing innovation requires flexibility," and "resistance to change hampers progress," circulated company-wide, thinly disguised critiques clearly aimed at me. The undertones were unmistakable. I was cast as an obstacle to the firm's evolution. Colleagues who once exchanged nods or brief conversations now steered clear, their eyes flickering with the caution of those who knew better than to cross the new power. Even Eric, usually steadfast, became wary. The social isolation was surgical. Financially, the blow was sharp. My annual bonus was eliminated entirely, and commission rates slashed by 20%, a cut that gnawed deeply into personal stability. The mounting pressure was palpable at home. Sarah noticed the tension creeping into my voice during calls late at night. Yet despite the erosion of status and income, I maintained a composed exterior. Every email that forwarded the new title, every budget document showing reduced allocations, I archived digitally with timestamps. My personal logs grew with detailed notes on meetings I was excluded from, the sudden redistribution of my clients, and Frederick's undisguised campaign to undermine me. This was no random act, but a calculated strategy to force me out or discredit my standing before any legal challenge could be mounted. The quiet desperation settled in during the long evenings, staring at the flickering screen that barely responded, knowing the firm's heartbeat continued without me. But amidst the decline, a cold clarity formed. Frederick's moves were predictable. His arrogance blinded him to the fact that I was still here, still documenting, still assessing. The humiliation of isolation sharpened my focus. This low point was not an end. It was a pivot. I resolved internally that the campaign against me would become the blueprint for the strategy I would unleash. I was a cornered man, but corners are where the deadliest strikes begin. When the termination letter arrived that Friday at 5 p.m., it landed like a calculated blow rather than a surprise. Frederick cited company restructuring as the official reason, a phrase devoid of meaning yet heavy with finality. I read the letter once, then again, registering the sterile language that masked his intent. But the deeper wound lay in the documents I uncovered during that weekend. Frederick had quietly amended the partnership agreement, a clandestine maneuver that slashed my 25% equity stake to below 5%. The timing was deliberate, executed immediately after I refused to sign a non-disclosure agreement designed to bury his unauthorized deals in silence. The impact was staggering. Approximately $1.5 million in equity evaporated overnight, dissolving the tangible proof of my 9 years of contribution. Further investigation revealed a parallel empire Frederick had constructed, a shadow consulting firm operating through shell companies. These entities siphoned clients and funds, leveraging my proprietary pricing algorithm without permission. This was no mere breach of trust. It was outright theft and fraud, a criminal enterprise hidden behind corporate facades. The realization sank in cold and hard. My legacy, my expertise, my work, the foundation of my career, had been co-opted and corrupted for personal gain. The betrayal was not just personal, it was systemic. The partner I had once trusted was now an adversary playing a ruthless game. Despite the shock, my response was clinical. There was no room for anger or despair, only a clear-headed assessment and strategic calculation. Now I understand the game, I muttered to myself, voice low but resolute. It's no longer about partnership, it's about winning through systems and facts. I reached for my phone and dialed Mark Dawson without hesitation. There was no time for grief. Mobilization was imperative. As the line connected, I began outlining the next steps, activating the machinery that would pivot from defense to offense. This was the breaking point, where compliance ended and calculated opposition began. In the days following the termination, I embarked on a rigorous assessment of the assets and liabilities on both sides of this battle. I spread out every contract, every version of the partnership agreement, every corporate bylaw on my desk. Each document was scrutinized under the lens of legal precision. My analysis flagged multiple breaches. Frederick's unilateral contract modifications violated the unanimous consent requirement. Financial records hinted at embezzlement. Intellectual property rights tied to my pricing algorithm were flagrantly infringed. This was not just a personal vendetta. It was a catalogue of corporate malfeasance ripe for regulatory intervention. Consultations with Mark Dawson reinforced the gravity of the situation. We mapped out credible claims of fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and violations under SEC and IRS statutes. Mark's legal expertise translated the dense regulatory language into actionable strategies. His confirmation that Frederick's conduct exposed the firm to criminal investigation was a rare glimmer of leverage. I began compiling a roster of allies, trusted former colleagues willing to provide sworn testimony against Frederick. Eric Porter, reliable and discreet, was first on the list, alongside 3 others whose loyalty hadn't wavered despite the risks. Simultaneously, I catalogued client communications that evidenced unauthorized dealings by Frederick and Emily. These documents formed a damning narrative of deception, illustrating how Frederick had compromised client trust for personal gain. Anticipating regulatory scrutiny over $1.2 million in financial irregularities, I began drafting formal complaints to be filed with the SEC and state authorities. The process was methodical, unemotional, an exercise in strategic preparation. I envisioned this like a siege. Phase 1 securing evidence, Phase 2 legal assault, Phase 3 client reassurance. It was a cold, calculated orchestration of justice masquerading as bureaucracy. The emotional turmoil was tempered by professional detachment. This was not revenge, it was systemic justice. I viewed myself as the instrument of accountability, wielding contracts, emails, and affidavits like precision tools. Each step was premeditated, every action documented. I recognized the necessity to protect not only my interests, but the integrity of the firm and clients. This was no small disruption. It was a surgical strike designed to dismantle the corruption at Hendricks & Co. The transformation from betrayed partner to strategic adversary was complete. I was no longer a victim, but a calculated force ready to reclaim control. Securing the evidence required technical rigor. I consolidated all digital materials into encrypted vaults, employing multi-factor authentication and off-site backups to guard against tampering or deletion. 9 years of emails, multiple contract versions, financial statements, and internal memos were exported onto isolated external drives. The chain of custody was maintained meticulously, with logs noting every access and transfer. 5 former colleagues, including Eric Porter, signed notarized affidavits attesting to Frederick's embezzlement and hostile takeover efforts. Each affidavit was executed with solemn formality, reinforcing the legal weight of my case. I filed a provisional copyright registration for my pricing algorithm, establishing an official timestamp preceding Frederick's unauthorized replication. This was crucial. Without intellectual property claims, my leverage would be irreparably weakened. I established direct contact with regulatory bodies' whistleblower divisions to understand filing protocols and ensure compliance with procedural requirements. These interactions were clinical and guarded. I revealed only what was necessary, preserving the element of strategic surprise. To stabilize my personal finances during the impending legal battle, I secured a contingency consulting contract with a rival firm. This move was tactical. It provided income without compromising my position or confidentiality agreements. I drafted a comprehensive timeline and evidence matrix, mapping each piece of data to specific allegations for regulatory submission. Mark Dawson prepared formal complaint drafts and legal notices, ready for immediate dispatch. Every document, every communication, every affidavit was aligned toward a singular objective: systemic justice, executed within legal frameworks. Frederick remained oblivious to the impending storm. His overconfidence blinded him to the methodical, strategic force I had marshaled. I positioned myself at least 10 steps ahead, leveraging every legal, technical, and human resource at my disposal. This was no longer a personal dispute. It was a corporate siege, and I was the architect of its inevitable outcome. The path was clear, the strategy precise, and the resolve unyielding. The next moves would be decisive. I began by reaching out to my top-tier clients, those who had consistently trusted me over the years. The conversations were measured, calibrated with precision to avoid raising suspicion within Hendricks & Co. I informed them of my planned departure in a manner that emphasized continuity rather than disruption. "My commitment to your success remains unchanged," I assured them during calls, carefully planting confidence in my professionalism despite the seismic changes underway. 4 clients expressed clear intent to follow me to my new consultancy, an affirmation not just of loyalty, but a strategic foothold in sustaining my post-litigation viability. The next administrative step was finalizing the legal and business framework to support my emerging consultancy. I registered the new entity, Joseph King Consulting LLC, ensuring all filings complied with state and federal requirements. Parallel to this, my legal counsel finalized their retainer agreements, locking in their commitment. Mark Dawson, my lead attorney, filed preliminary notices of intent to sue, serving them discreetly to Frederick and the firm. The language was formal, non-accusatory, but unmistakably clear. The firm was on notice. These notices functioned as a legal tripwire, alerting Frederick without revealing the full breadth of my strategy. I arranged a confidential meeting with Linda Barrett, the regulatory compliance officer, to verify procedural protocols for whistleblower submissions. Our discussion was professional, sterile. I asked pointed questions about timelines, evidence requirements, and confidentiality safeguards. "I want to ensure every submission is airtight," I told her, never betraying the full scope of my plans. Linda's responses were measured but thorough, and I left the meeting reassured that regulatory mechanisms could be leveraged with precision. Meanwhile, Frederick continued to project unshakable confidence in public company forums, seemingly unaware of the tightening web around him. Throughout this phase, I maintained strict control over communication channels and timing. Every email, every call was filtered through secure lines. I set a firm deadline aligned with the company's fiscal year-end reporting cycle, selecting a moment when regulatory scrutiny would naturally intensify. Internally, the atmosphere was one of calculated calm. The chessboard was laid out methodically, each piece positioned with strategic intent. Externally, my demeanor remained composed and unruffled, no hint of the storm to come. Anticipation was cloaked in discipline. Every move was measured, every silence deliberate. The days leading up to action were spent in silent preparation, a final verification of all evidence and documentation. I cross-checked every contract, every email, ensuring consistency and compliance with legal standards. The significance of these hours was paramount. There was no room for error. During a strategic discussion, Sarah King reaffirmed her unwavering support and extended additional client network contacts. Her perspective was invaluable in solidifying the client transition strategy. "We have to be ready for any backlash," she warned, underscoring the stakes. I agreed, integrating her insights into the contingency plans. With a sense of finality, I formalized the whistleblower complaint, attaching all affidavits, financial analyses, and correspondence. The date for submission was chosen with surgical precision, coinciding with the release of Hendricks & Co. His annual financial report, a time guaranteed to attract maximum regulatory and media attention. I organized my team, legal experts, technical analysts, and my personal advisors, placing them on alert for any countermeasures Frederick might unleash. We reviewed probable risks, and I confirmed protocols for immediate client notifications should the firm attempt to disrupt service continuity. There was a pervasive stillness in the days before submission, the professional equivalent of the calm before a storm. Despite the tension, my confidence never wavered. I understood that timing and control were paramount. Once the action commenced, it needed to be irreversible, decisive. The interplay of strategy and patience honed every decision. Each step was deliberate, every detail accounted for. The plan was no longer theoretical, it was primed for execution. A confidential meeting with Eric Porter uncovered a critical, unforeseen development that tilted the balance further in my favor. Eric disclosed that Frederick's hand-picked replacement for my role, a young manager named Kevin Mitchell, had catastrophically mishandled client portfolios and internal operations. Kevin's incompetence was not just a minor setback. It had culminated in a staggering $2 million client loss over a single quarter and multiple contract breaches that exposed the firm to regulatory penalties. This revelation shattered Frederick's carefully curated narrative of seamless transition. Clients were already reacting, with some threatening to sever ties entirely. Eric described a growing internal alarm within the firm, with whispers of operational collapse circulating discreetly among senior staff. Frederick's desperation to conceal Kevin's failures from the board was palpable. Internal communications showed frantic attempts to reframe narratives and contain damage. This internal disaster magnified the severity of Frederick's position. No longer was the issue solely about embezzlement and unauthorized deals. The firm's operational integrity was on the brink of collapse, jeopardizing client trust and regulatory compliance simultaneously. I immediately integrated this damaging information into the complaint documents, enhancing the scope and urgency of the regulatory filings. The narrative now included not only fraudulent behavior, but also the imminent risk of financial insolvency linked directly to Frederick's reckless decisions. This development provided leverage beyond expectation, broadening the investigation's focus and strengthening the case for swift regulatory intervention. The twist redefined the stakes. Frederick's leadership was not only corrupt, but deeply incompetent. Strategically, this discovery allowed me to recalibrate my approach. I began drafting supplementary evidence packets and preparing targeted questions for regulatory bodies, emphasizing operational risk alongside financial misconduct. The internal disaster also opened new avenues for negotiations, increasing pressure on Frederick to consider settlements or concessions. Throughout, I maintained clinical detachment, viewing these developments as tactical advantages rather than personal victories. The battlefield had shifted, and I was adapting with precision. The first phase of execution commenced with the formal filing of whistleblower complaints to the SEC, IRS, and state regulatory agencies. The submissions were comprehensive, detailing financial mismanagement, embezzlement, unauthorized contracts, and intellectual property theft. The documentation was precise, corroborated by affidavits and time-stamped evidence. Simultaneously, Mark Dawson served formal legal notices to Hendricks & Co., demanding immediate audits and cessation of unauthorized activities. These notices functioned as legal embargoes, halting Frederick's covert operations abruptly. In parallel, I activated contractual clauses that allowed suspension of proprietary service modules linked to Frederick's shadow entities. This move effectively froze operations, cutting off revenue streams he depended on. Key clients were notified confidentially, apprised of potential risks, but reassured of my commitment to uninterrupted service through Joseph King Consulting. These communications were measured and professional, designed to maintain client trust while signaling a shift in control. Frederick's initial response to the regulatory inquiries and legal notices was visible distress, manifesting in hurried internal meetings and damage control efforts. Despite his attempts to downplay the severity, the cracks were evident to those who observed closely. Internally, tension rippled through Hendricks & Co., with executives caught between loyalty and self-preservation. I remained outwardly composed, my communications sterile and unwavering, projecting unshakable confidence. No personal attacks, no emotional outbursts, only cold, precise professionalism. The first blows landed decisively, initiating systemic pressure that would ripple through Frederick's empire. The groundwork I had laid, meticulous documentation, strategic timing, and controlled client communications, was bearing fruit. Frederick was forced onto the defensive, confronted by regulatory mechanisms and legal imperatives he could no longer evade. This initial phase was critical. It set the momentum and established the framework for subsequent actions. The game had changed irrevocably, but the battle was far from over. The boardroom was tense but sterile, a glass and steel chamber where power was supposed to be exercised with clinical precision. I stood at the head of the table, Mark Dawson beside me, as the assembled directors, legal counsel, and key clients took their seats. The air was thick with expectation, but I kept my voice steady, my demeanor controlled. I began with the audit trail. Every transaction I presented was a thread unraveling Frederick's carefully spun web. The $1.2 million siphoned off through shell vendors, the kickbacks wired to shadow accounts, and the blatant breaches of our partnership agreement were laid bare in spreadsheet after spreadsheet. The room flickered with disbelief. Mark handed out printouts of internal communications, emails between Frederick and his cronies, arranging unauthorized deals, the frantic memos attempting to mask operational failures. Then came the client testimonials, recorded statements from executives who had been blindsided by Kevin Mitchell's bungling, their contracts breached, and portfolios mismanaged. The cumulative evidence was overwhelming. Frederick attempted to speak, his voice laced with that familiar arrogance, dismissing the claims as business discretion, strained under market pressures. But the seasoned lawyers cut through the rhetoric, dissecting his justifications with legal precision. I watched as the board's expressions shifted, initial shock morphing into resolute concern. A few directors exchanged glances, their body language signaling a shift in allegiance. The key clients, previously hesitant, now openly voiced support for my stewardship and the new consultancy model I proposed. The momentum had decisively swung. As the vote commenced, Frederick's authority dissolved before my eyes, replaced by cold formalities ordering his suspension pending external investigation. The room felt simultaneously emptied and electric. This was my moment. Professionalism and preparation had won without a single raised voice, the law and facts doing the work that confrontation never could. The meeting adjourned with a palpable sense of finality. As I gathered my materials, a quiet confidence settled over me. This was not triumph born of vengeance, but of strategy executed flawlessly. The power reversal was complete, not by brute force, but through the meticulous accumulation of undeniable proof. Frederick's empire, built on deceit and blind ambition, was fracturing under the weight of its own corruption. I stepped out into the sunlight, the crash of the gavel echoing behind me, knowing that the real work was just beginning. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within days, the SEC and IRS opened formal investigations, their notices detailing penalties totaling $1.75 million levied against Hendricks and Cody. Regulatory mandates followed, demanding corporate governance reforms and external audits to prevent a recurrence of the breaches uncovered. Frederick's brokerage license was frozen. Media outlets specializing in finance circulated scathing exposés that painted him as a cautionary tale of greed unchecked. Competitors distanced themselves, wary of contamination by association. I monitored developments from my newly established consultancy office, remote but deeply connected. Clients were transferring their accounts with quiet urgency, their faith shifting decisively toward the stability I offered. The firm's valuation plummeted, triggering emergency measures to stabilize what remained of operations. Employee testimonies and client complaints expanded the scope of investigations, revealing a systemic dysfunction linked directly to Frederick's mismanagement. From a distance, I observed the regulatory system functioning as intended, dispassionate and thorough, administering justice through fines, sanctions, and enforced transparency. I felt no satisfaction in the destruction, only a sober recognition that these were necessary outcomes of systemic enforcement. My focus remained resolutely forward, rebuilding the trust shattered by one man's avarice, restoring order through accountable leadership and professional rigor. The consequences were severe but proportionate, a reckoning for corruption, not personal vendetta. Frederick's desperation grew as his options narrowed. He approached me with a settlement offer, $500,000, and a nominal consulting role within his crumbling empire. I rejected it without hesitation. The sum was paltry, the role a token of his fading influence. Not long after, he attempted to undermine me by anonymously leaking selective emails to the press, insinuating I was a disgruntled employee. The strategy backfired spectacularly. Witnesses and forensic experts swiftly debunked the fabricated context, exposing the leaks as a smear campaign. His legal team escalated, issuing cease and desist notices to my new clients, threatening litigation to intimidate them into returning to Hendricks and Kosa. The moves were predictable, but ineffective. My contracts were airtight, my regulatory backing unassailable. Meanwhile, Frederick issued a public apology, a hollow gesture devoid of substance, designed merely to placate a skeptical media. Regulatory bodies dismissed his attempts at settlement outright, pressing forward with prosecution. Isolated and exposed, Frederick's influence diminished rapidly. Some former allies stepped forward to apologize, acknowledging their complicity or silence, but the damage was irreparable. I maintained my composure throughout, professionally managing client transitions and legal proceedings with unwavering focus. I embodied the principle that true victory lay not in personal retribution, but in disciplined, systemic resolution. Frederick's final manipulations were failures of desperation, underscoring the inevitability of his downfall. King's strategic advisory launched with immediate impact. 47 former clients transitioned on day one, generating $7.8 million in first-year revenue, a 15% increase over my previous portfolio's performance. The legal settlement awarded me $1.8 million in compensation, along with full rights to my proprietary pricing algorithm and client contracts. Regulatory reforms mandated a governance overhaul at Hendricks & Co., and Frederick exited entirely, stripped of equity and barred from future financial roles. My professional reputation not only recovered but flourished. Industry accolades recognized integrity and strategic acumen, reinforcing the legitimacy of my leadership. The personal dimension stabilized as well. Sarah's support deepened, bolstered by financial security and professional validation. In quiet moments, I reflected on the journey, distilling the lesson that competence and documentation are currencies far more enduring than greed or nepotism. I prepared for the next chapter with measured confidence. The boardroom battles and legal wrangling were behind me. Ahead lay new challenges met with facts, systems, and calculated precision. Frederick's downfall was complete, leaving behind the ruins of arrogance and corruption. In contrast, I stood objectively stronger, a testament to professionalism prevailing in the face of corporate conflict. There was no triumphalism in my demeanor, only a resolute readiness to lead, grounded in the unwavering logic of strategic justice.